So this was the GRE Analytical Writing, where you had 2 essays, 30 minutes each, approximately 400 to 700 words. As I said, the GMAT is just 1 essay, and it's an argument essay. So answers are typed on the computer. There's no minimum number of words, but you should be aiming for about 400. Some grammar and spelling errors are not penalised if they don't interfere with communication task. Scoring is from 0 to 6. It's scored by 2 trained raters. So the argument essay, you're looking for flaws in the writer's reasoning process. You are identifying assumptions and assessing their credibility. You're looking to evaluate the evidence in favour of the writer's claims. You should make suggestions as to how the argument could be improved or what type of evidence would weaken the claims. Do not present personal opinions. That's absolutely really important in the argument essay. In the issue essay, I say minimize it or try to avoid it where possible, but it might not always be possible. Right, so main criteria for grading: identification and evaluation of the argument's main elements, and an analysis of the implications. Organisation and articulation of your thoughts, so clear paragraph structure, good use of structural and transition words, furthermore, in addition, on the other hand, and so on. Clearly articulate your thoughts. This was one of the issues I thought we had in the samples which I got from you guys, that you were making valid points, but the way you were sort of expressing them, it can be improved in terms of the articulation, the clarity. Okay, but that's something we're going to work on. Right, use of relevant examples to support your arguments, and then handling of the mechanics of standard written English. Right, 6 steps. First rule, read and understand the question. Very important, because I have, I've marked a lot of essays in the past, and I can say with confidence that one of the biggest problems I get and I see is that people don't answer the question. People seem to have this tendency to want to reinterpret the question in the way that suits them. Okay, so if we take this essay question that I just gave you last week about technology impacting on our ability to think for ourselves, many times I've had that essay back where people have provided very good essay on the advantages and the disadvantages of technology. But obviously that's not what the question asks. It doesn't ask what are the advantages and the disadvantages of technology. It asks simply, how does technology impact on our ability to think for ourselves? Keep that question in mind. Don't deviate from the question. Don't try to reinterpret it in the way that you want to write the essay. Just answer the question. Okay? It's easier to say than it is to do, I think, sometimes. Very important. Step 2. Identify the claims and note them down. So this is especially relevant for the argument essay. Okay, so this is, I think, this is referring to this argument essay here. Okay, so this was to serve the housing needs. We've considered this before in a previous lesson. So to serve the housing needs of our students, Buckingham College should build a number of new dormitories. Buckingham's enrollment is growing, and based on current trends will double over the next 50 years, thus making existing dormitory space inadequate. Moreover, the average rent for an apartment in our town has risen in recent years. Consequently, students will find it increasingly difficult to afford off-campus housing. And finally, attractive new dormitories would make prospective students more likely to enroll at Buckingham. Okay. So write a response in which you discuss what specific evidence is needed to evaluate the argument. Okay, just a sec. We're looking at the claims. Right, the claims are: students will find it increasingly difficult to find affordable off-campus housing. Enrollment is growing and will double in 50 years. Existing dorm space is inadequate. Average rent in town has risen in recent years. Therefore, more dorms should be built. Building attractive new dorms would make prospective students more likely to attend. So that's the claims listed. That's what you should do. Try to list the claims. Show the examiner that you've been able to identify what the claims are. Okay, so now you step 3, evaluating the claims. More dorms should be built. Why? Enrollment will double. Existing dorm space inadequate. Off-campus rents rise. What's the evidence? What's the evidence for enrollment doubling? What's the evidence for existing dorm space being inadequate or off-campus rents rising? Subsidiary claim: attractive new dorms will increase enrollment. Why is this necessary? How could the argument be strengthened and weakened? So that's the way you're going to tackle it. Basically look at all of the claims and analyze them, critically evaluate them one by one, try to pick holes in each one of them. Why will students find it increasingly difficult to find affordable off-campus housing? It's an assumption. Enrollment is growing and will double in 50 years. What kind of analysis has been done to sort of bring that claim? How do we know that's going to happen? How do we know it's going to double in 50 years? Why 50 years? Okay. Existing dorm space is inadequate. Has a survey been carried out? How do we know that this space is inadequate? Average rent in town has risen in recent years. Okay, by what measure and relative to what? From what to what? We want to say, so how much exactly, by what percentage has rent risen? And has student income also risen or fallen? It's relevant to evaluating the argument. Is student finance and student loans more available now than it was in the past? If it is, then it's going to make a difference to the argument, because it means students are generally richer, so they will be able to afford off-campus housing. So therefore more dorms should be built. Well, I don't think they've made that argument convincing. And it says, building attractive new dorms would make prospective students more likely to enroll. Again, has a questionnaire been administered to obtain reliable information about this? How have they obtained their information? Is it just a guess? Have they asked 1 or 2 students? We don't know. And that type of information would be really important to evaluate the argument, and it would strengthen the argument if we had valid information from scientific sources. Okay. Right, so step 4, make a plan. So you make notes, plan and outline, very important skills to develop. It seems to take time, but in the long run it saves you time. And what I should say, as somebody who has marked essays again, I can usually tell the difference between an essay that has been planned in advance from an essay that has not been planned. I can usually see this. Okay. So you want to organize your ideas in a hierarchical order. So the most important claims first, because remember, you're under time pressure here. So you want to make sure that if you do run out of time, you've got all your most important ideas down first, and the least important ideas you can leave to the end. Okay, so for each claim, you need to support with relevant examples or reasons. Step 5, write. Write the body of your essay. Should take about 15 minutes. That means the remaining 15 minutes is for planning, for brainstorming, and for revising and rereading your essay at the end. So write down your strongest points of claims first. Keep time in mind, but try not to feel overly time pressured, as this will slow the flow of ideas. Focus more on the strength of your arguments than elegance. Okay, this is especially the case for the argument essay. What the examiners are interested in there, the emphasis is more on the strength of your argument and your critical analysis skills, rather than elegance. So don't try to write in a beautiful way, or in a really sort of creative. Don't be too creative, is what I'm saying. You've just got to identify the claims, put them down, critique them one by one, and that's it. So don't try to be too creative, it usually doesn't work. So step 6, reread and revise. Now, I mentioned to the guys in the last session that this is a very important thing to do. And I know this because I've, in the past, taken GMAT-GRE tests, practice tests, and I haven't reread and revised my written work, and later on I've seen some very obvious mistakes in my work, which I kick myself for, because I couldn't believe I could make such mistakes, but you can, and we all do it. And you can guarantee that if you spend a bit of time revising and rereading what you've written, you'll find some mistakes. So those mistakes that you find, they're worth points. So you should always give yourself a little bit of time at the end, 1 or 2 minutes, to revise and reread what you've written. And so look at how the essay flows, look at any sort of grammatical errors, look at any sort of obvious points where you could have made the argument stronger, and so on. It's really important to do that at the end, because you can pick up extra marks by doing that. Okay, so introduction and summary paragraphs. Your introduction should be a very general statement summarizing the argument and the claims made. For example, the author makes a series of claims in this passage. She says A, B, and C. I'm going to analyze these claims one by one and make a conclusion as to their justification. Your conclusion should summarize the points made. Don't introduce anything new into the conclusion, apart from possibly suggestions as to how the author could have strengthened their argument. So your first paragraph, these are typical sort of phrases or terminology that you can use in the first paragraph. First, the argument readily assumes that the statement is a stretch. For example, clearly the argument could have been much clearer if it explicitly stated that. Second paragraph. Second, the argument claims that. This is again a very weak and unsupported claim. In fact, it's not at all clear if the argument had provided evidence that. Okay, so different ways to word the same sort of ideas. Third paragraph, finally. Without convincing answers to these questions, one is left with the impression that the claim is based more on wishful thinking than substantive evidence. Conclusion. In conclusion, the argument is flawed for the above-mentioned reasons and is therefore unconvincing or invalid. It could be considerably strengthened if the author clearly mentioned all the relevant facts and so on. It provided a survey, provided a cost-benefit analysis, or whatever. Okay. Right, so this is the example I gave some of you guys to do for homework. Okay. So I'll just put it out there, and I'll also put that onto the Telegram messenger, so you have that as a homework. It's an analytical writing exercise argument. So we looked at some of the claims that are being made, then questioned the claims, and then I went over a few tactics. Try to provide a balanced approach, avoid extremes, Be dispassionate and professional. And by extremes, I mean things like try not to say something like, it is always the case that, or it's never the case that. We would usually qualify what we say by saying usually, or more often, or not necessarily the case that, or it tends to be the case that, something like that. So about avoiding extremes. Avoid personal opinions, stay emotionally unattached to the topic. Focus on the objective arguments, pro and con. Replace I think with it appears that, or the evidence suggests that, or one could argue that. And your emphasis is on critical analysis rather than elegance. Use appropriate transition words such as therefore, although, however, furthermore. This helps to give the writing fluency and coherence. You'll get points for using appropriate transition words. Right. Key structural and transition words. There's just some examples. Furthermore, in addition, moreover, to express the importance of something, surely, truly, undoubtedly, clearly, in fact, most importantly, to express contrast, on the contrary, yet, despite, rather, instead, and so on. And then just a few more examples. So the conclusion is unwarranted on the basis of the evidence provided. The conclusion does not follow from the premise. The reasoning seems highly suspect. As it stands, the author's argument is not convincing or compelling, and the argument is unconvincing as it stands. Right. So in sum, aim for at least 400 words. Make sure you understand the question. Focus on the arguments, no personal opinions, support with examples, plan your essay, review and reread.